the haunting melody of a gramophone playing in the distance, a needle scratching against worn vinyl, the tune, a melancholic wedding march that seems to waver between joy and sorrow. What if I told you that photographs capture more than just moments? What if they sometimes reveal things our eyes cannot see, things that perhaps were never meant to be seen at all? In the autumn of 1974, while clearing out my grandmother's attic in Boston, I discovered an old leather-bound album tucked away in a cedar chest. The pages were yellowed, the binding cracked with age. Most of the photographs inside were faded sepia portraits of stern-faced relatives I'd never known, men with impressive mustaches and women in high-necked dresses, their expressions solemn as they stared into the camera for the required long exposure. But there was one photograph that caught my attention, a wedding party from 1912. My great-grandmother Eliza Blackwood's wedding to Jonathan Pierce. 40 people arranged in neat rows on the lawn of what I recognized as the old Pierce estate in western Massachusetts. Men in their finest suits, women in elaborate dresses, all frozen in that peculiar stiffness that characterized photographs of that era. I might have simply placed it back in the album, just another family heirloom, had it not been for what I noticed when holding it up to the light streaming through the attic window. Something that made my blood run cold. 40 guests, all arranged for posterity on that bright summer day in 1912. But on the ground beneath them, only 39 shadows. My name is Thomas Pierce. I'm a history professor at Miskatonic University, and this is the story of how my great-grandmother's wedding photograph led me down a path I never expected to tread. A path that would reveal a family secret buried for generations. The year was 1974. Nixon had just resigned. The Vietnam War was finally ending, and I was 32 years old with a new tenure-track position and a recent divorce. My grandmother Eleanor Pierce had passed away that summer, leaving me her house on Beacon Hill, a narrow brownstone filled with antiques and family heirlooms dating back to colonial times. I hadn't been particularly close to my grandmother. She was a reserved woman who rarely spoke of the past, and our interactions had been limited to obligatory holiday dinners and the occasional letter. But as her only living descendant, I was now responsible for sorting through the accumulated possessions of 6 generations of Pierces. It was a rainy Saturday in October when I found the photograph. Thunder rolled outside as I knelt on the dusty attic floor, the album open on my lap, staring at the wedding party arranged on the sunlit lawn. They stood in 3 rows, the seated elders in front, the bride and groom in the center of the middle row, and the younger guests standing at the back. The light that day must have been harsh and directly overhead, for the shadows beneath each guest were sharp and dark against the grass, all except for one. In the back row, 5th from the right, stood a tall, slender woman in a dark dress. She was beautiful in an unsettling way. Pale skin, dark hair pulled back severely from her face, her expression blank while those around her managed slight smiles. And beneath her, where her shadow should have been, nothing. Just the same sunlit grass as everywhere else, not touched by shadow. I assumed it was a flaw in the photograph, some trick of the development process perhaps. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became that something was wrong. Every other shadow was precisely where it should be, falling at exactly the same angle. Only hers was missing. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, someone had written, "Eliza and Jonathan's wedding, June 18th, 1912. 40 guests present to witness their union. 40 guests. 39 shadows. I might have dismissed it as curiosity and nothing more had I not found my great-grandmother's journal tucked into the same chest. A small leather-bound book, its pages filled with elegant flowing handwriting. I opened it at random and began to read. June 20th, 1912. I cannot shake the feeling that something followed us back from the church. Jonathan insists I am being fanciful, that the stress of the wedding has left me overwrought, but I know what I saw in the mirror this morning, or rather, what I did not see. For the briefest moment, as I was pinning my hair, my reflection vanished entirely. When I blinked, it had returned, but the cold dread remains. The woman in the gray dress, the one who arrived with the Whiteleys, though no one seemed to know her name, I am certain she watches me when she thinks I am not aware. I flipped through more pages, my heart racing. June 25th, 1912. Mrs. Sullivan from the village brought our wedding photographs today. Jonathan and I sat together in the parlor to examine them. The photographs are lovely, though I find I cannot bear to look at them for long. There is something in them that disturbs me greatly, though Jonathan sees nothing amiss. I dare not speak of it, even to these pages, for fear that acknowledging it might somehow give it power. I closed the journal, a chill running down my spine despite the stuffy attic heat. What had Eliza seen in those photographs? The same thing I had noticed, the missing shadow, and what had happened to the mysterious woman no one seemed to know. That night, I dreamt of the photograph. In my dream, I stood on that same sunlit lawn, watching the wedding party arrange themselves for the picture. The woman in the dark dress stood apart from the others, watching me with cold, knowing eyes. When I woke, sweating and tangled in my sheets, I could have sworn I caught a glimpse of a tall, slender silhouette against my bedroom wall, though I was alone in the house. The next morning, I began my research in earnest. If the date on the photograph was accurate, June 18, 1912, then perhaps local newspapers might have covered the wedding. The Pierces had been a prominent family in Massachusetts after all. The university library had archives of the Boston Globe and several smaller local papers on microfilm. I spent hours scrolling through June 1912, eyes strained against the glowing screen, until I found what I was looking for. Society Wedding in Arkham. Miss Eliza Blackwood, daughter of industrialist George Blackwood, wed Mr. Jonathan Pierce, heir to the Pierce shipping fortune, in a lavish ceremony at St. Michael's Church on Tuesday last. The reception was held at the Pierce family estate, with 40 guests in attendance. The bride wore her mother's lace veil, and the groom's gift to his bride was a diamond pendant of considerable size and quality. The happy couple departs next week for a European honeymoon tour. 40 guests. The number kept appearing, confirming what had been written on the back of the photograph. I dug deeper into the archives, looking for any mention of an incident at the wedding, perhaps something unusual that might explain my great-grandmother's disquiet. But there was nothing. As I was about to give up for the day, I decided to check the obituaries from the weeks following the wedding, following a hunch that I couldn't quite articulate. There, in the July 8, 1912 edition, I found a small notice. Mysterious disappearance. Concern grows for Miss Catherine Whiteley, 27, who has not been seen since attending the Pierce Blackwood wedding on June 18th. Miss Whiteley, a school teacher recently returned from studies abroad, was last seen departing the Pierce estate late in the evening. Any information regarding her whereabouts should be directed to the Arkham Police Department. Catherine Whiteley. Could she have been the woman without a shadow? But no. The journal mentioned a woman who arrived with the Whiteleys, not a Whiteley herself. I needed more information. The Pierce estate had been sold decades ago, shortly after my grandfather's death in 1952. But the house still stood, now serving as a small historical museum dedicated to the shipping industry that had built the family fortune. I decided to visit, hoping to find more records, or perhaps speak to someone who might know about the wedding photograph. The estate was a 2-hour drive from Boston, located on a large property overlooking the Atlantic. The main house was an imposing Victorian structure, its white paint peeling slightly, giving it a ghostly appearance against the gray October sky. A small sign directed visitors to the entrance, where a bored-looking young woman sat at a desk. "Welcome to the Pierce Maritime Museum," she said without looking up from her book. "Admission is $3. I paid and explained that I was researching my family history. I'm Thomas Pierce, actually. My great-grandparents were married here in 1912. That got her attention. "Oh, you're a Pierce? That's so interesting. I'm Andrea, by the way. I'm just a summer intern. But Mrs. Winters is our curator. She knows everything about this place. Let me see if she's available." Mrs. Winters turned out to be a formidable woman in her 60s, with steel gray hair and piercing blue eyes. When Andrea introduced me, her expression sharpened with interest. "A Pierce, here in the flesh. How extraordinary. We don't often get family members visiting." She extended her hand. "Helen Winters. I've been curator here for 20 years. I showed her the wedding photograph, carefully removed from the album and placed in a protective sleeve. "I'm trying to learn more about my great-grandparents' wedding, particularly about the guests who attended." Mrs. Winters examined the photograph carefully through her reading glasses. "Ah, yes, the Pierce Blackwood wedding. Quite the social event of the season. We have several items from it in our collection. Eliza's veil, Jonathan's cufflinks, even the original guest list, I believe." My heart quickened. "The guest list? May I see it?" She led me to a small research room filled with filing cabinets. "Our archives aren't as organized as I'd like, but..." She trailed off, opening drawers and flipping through folders. "Ah, here we are. Pierce Blackwood wedding, June 1912. The folder contained several items. A pressed flower that might have come from the bride's bouquet, a handwritten menu for the reception dinner, a small swatch of lace from the dress, and finally a card with flowing script listing the names of all who had been invited. I scanned the list, finding the Whiteley family, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Whiteley, and their daughter Catherine, but there was no mention of another woman accompanying them. "Is this everything?" I asked. "The newspaper mentioned 40 guests, but I only count 39 names here." Mrs. Winters frowned, recounting the names. "You're right. How strange." She tapped the photograph. "Which one is missing from the list, I wonder?" I pointed to the woman without a shadow. "Do you recognize her? The tall woman in the dark dress, in the back row." Mrs. Winters leaned closer, squinting. Then she went very still. "That's unusual," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled. The way the light falls on her face makes it difficult to make out her features clearly. Almost as if... She stopped herself. "Almost as if what?" I prompted. "Nothing. Just an old woman's fanciful thinking." She straightened up. "Mr. Pierce, there's someone you might want to speak with. Margaret Sullivan. Her grandmother was the local photographer who took this wedding picture. Margaret still lives in town. If anyone might know something about this photograph, it would be her." Mrs. Winters wrote down an address on a slip of paper. "She doesn't have a telephone, I'm afraid. Rather old-fashioned that way. But she's usually home in the afternoons." I thanked her for her help and was about to leave when she caught my arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. "Mr. Pierce," she said quietly, "be careful with your questions. Some stories in this town, some stories are better left untold." Before I could ask what she meant, she had turned away, busying herself with returning the folder to its drawer. Margaret Sullivan lived in a small cottage at the edge of town, its garden overgrown with late-blooming roses and herbs gone wild. When I knocked, the door was opened by a tiny woman with a cloud of white hair and bright, bird-like eyes. "Yes?" she said, peering up at me suspiciously. I introduced myself and explained my purpose, showing her the photograph. At the mention of her grandmother, her expression softened. Come in. No one remembers Granny's work anymore. She was quite the artist with a camera, you know. One of the first women in the county to open her own photography studio. The inside of the cottage was cluttered but clean, every surface covered with photographs, books, and curious objects. Dried flowers, polished stones, small animal bones. She cleared a space at the kitchen table and gestured for me to sit. "Tea?" she offered, already filling a kettle. "I make it with mint from the garden." While she prepared the tea, I told her about my research, the missing shadow, and my great-grandmother's journal entries. Margaret listened without interruption, nodding occasionally. When I finished, she placed a steaming cup before me and sat down heavily in the chair opposite. "The Pierce Blackwood wedding," she said slowly. "Yes, I remember Granny talking about it." "Not the happiest day for photography," she said, though the weather was fine. "Something about the atmosphere being wrong. Granny was sensitive to such things." She took a sip of her tea, studying me over the rim of her cup. "The woman you're asking about, I believe she arrived uninvited. That happens at grand weddings, you know. People slipping in who don't belong." "But who was she?" I pressed. "And why doesn't she cast a shadow in the photograph?" Margaret set down her cup with a small clink. "Some things a camera captures that the eye does not see, and sometimes it's the other way around." She reached for the photograph. "May I?" I handed it to her, watching as she held it up to the light, much as I had done in my grandmother's attic. Her expression remained neutral, but I noticed her hands trembling slightly. "My grandmother had a gift," she said finally. "The Sullivan women always have. We see things others don't. Sometimes it shows in the photographs." "What kinds of things?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. "Things not entirely of this world, Mr. Pierce." She returned the photograph to me. "The woman you're asking about, I don't believe she was a woman at all." A chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" Margaret sighed. "There are old stories in these parts. Stories about the Pierce family and the land their house was built on. Stories about bargains made long ago before your great-grandfather was born." She rose from the table and went to a bookshelf, returning with a worn leather-bound volume. "This is my grandmother's journal from that year. She wrote about the wedding." She opened it carefully, the pages crackling with age. "June 18th, 1912, she read. "Photographed the Pierce Blackwood wedding today. 40 people in attendance, though only 39 appeared in the counting afterward. Strange business. The eldest Whiteley girl, Catherine, took ill during the reception. They say she fainted in the garden, though I did not witness it. There was another woman with the Whiteley party. tall, severe-looking, in a gray dress that seemed to shimmer oddly in certain lights. I do not recall seeing her arrive, nor did I see her leave. When I developed the photographs this evening, I noticed something peculiar about her image. I will speak to Reverend Morris tomorrow. He knows about such things. Margaret closed the journal. My grandmother went to the Reverend the next day, but he offered little help, only advised her to burn the negatives and speak of it to no one. Did she? Burn the negatives? Margaret shook her head. No, she kept them, hidden. She believed that destroying such things sometimes makes them stronger. She paused, studying my face. You have her eyes, you know, your great-grandmother's. The same look of someone who sees more than they should. I felt a prickle of unease. Mrs. Sullivan, what happened to Catherine Whiteley? The newspaper said she disappeared. Yes, Margaret said softly. Many believed she simply ran away. She was engaged to a man she did not love, from what I understand. But Granny always thought otherwise. What did she think? That Catherine was taken. In exchange. In exchange for what? Margaret didn't answer directly. Have you ever heard of a changeling, Mr. Pierce? In the old stories, the fair folk would sometimes steal a human child and leave one of their own in its place. But sometimes they take adults too, particularly at threshold moments. Births, weddings, deaths. Times when the veil between worlds is thinner. I stared at her, uncertainty wrestling with a growing dread. Are you suggesting that this woman in the photograph, the one without a shadow, was some kind of fairy? Margaret laughed, though the sound held no humor. Oh, Mr. Pierce, the fair folk are just one name for them. Every culture has stories of those who walk between worlds. Some call them angels, others demons. My grandmother called them the Watchers. And you believe one of these Watchers attended my great-grandparents' wedding? Why? To bear witness, she said simply. To ensure a bargain was kept. What bargain? Margaret looked at me for a long moment, as if deciding how much to tell me. The Pierces were not always wealthy, you know. Your great-great-grandfather, Thaddeus Pierce, was the one who built the family fortune. Rather suddenly, as I understand it, around 1880 or so. I nodded. He invested in shipping at the right time, made a fortune during the industrial boom. That's the public story, Margaret agreed. But there were rumors. Thaddeus was known to dabble in things beyond the common understanding. Books of ancient knowledge, rituals from distant lands. They say he traveled to strange places and returned. Who changed? She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper, though we were alone in the house. The story goes that he made a pact, wealth and prosperity for the Pierce family, in exchange for a firstborn daughter, to be claimed when she came of age. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. But that's just superstition, folk tales. Perhaps, Margaret conceded. But consider this. The Pierce family had no daughters for 2 generations after Thaddeus. Only sons, until your grandmother Eleanor. The first female Pierce born since the alleged pact. My grandmother wasn't taken by anything supernatural. I objected. She lived a long life. She died of natural causes just months ago. Yes, because the pact was fulfilled through another, Margaret said. Catherine Whiteley, who was engaged to Eleanor's uncle, your great-grandmother's brother. Had they married, Catherine would have become a Pierce by law, but she vanished before the wedding could take place. And so the debt remained unpaid, hanging over the family. I sat back, trying to process what I was hearing. It was absurd, of course, fairy tales and superstition. And yet, what about the missing shadow? How do you explain that? Margaret shrugged. Those not fully of this world don't cast shadows like we do. They don't reflect in mirrors either. They exist differently. She reached out suddenly and grasped my wrist, her fingers cold against my skin. Be careful, Mr. Pierce. In searching for this woman, you may draw her attention. The Watchers don't forget, and debts must always be paid. I left Margaret Sullivan's cottage with more questions than answers, her warning echoing in my mind. The sun was setting as I drove back to Boston, casting long shadows across the road, shadows that seemed to reach for my car like grasping fingers. That night, I dreamed again of the photograph, but this time, the woman without a shadow turned her head to look directly at me, her eyes black voids in her pale face. She smiled, revealing teeth too sharp for a human mouth, and began to step out of the photograph's frame toward me. I woke gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat. In the corner of my bedroom, for just an instant, I thought I saw a tall, slender silhouette. But when I turned on the lamp, there was nothing there. The next morning, I called the university and claimed illness, postponing my afternoon lecture. Instead, I drove to the Boston Public Library, determined to find more concrete information about Thaddeus Pierce and the origins of the family fortune. The library's archives were extensive, and with the help of a reference librarian, I located several promising sources: business records, old newspapers, even a biography of prominent Boston businessmen that included a chapter on my great-great-grandfather. The official accounts matched what I had always been told. Thaddeus Pierce, a moderately successful merchant, had made a series of shrewd investments in shipping and railroads during the 1880s, turning a small inheritance into a substantial fortune. He built the estate in Arkham in 1890 and became known for his philanthropy and interest in academic pursuits, particularly archaeology and anthropology. But as I dug deeper, I found hints of something more unusual. A small newspaper item from 1879 noted Thaddeus's return from a year-long expedition to the Orient and certain remote islands of the South Pacific in pursuit of antiquities and ethnographic studies. The article mentioned that he returned with several crates of artifacts, which he donated to various museums. Another clipping from 1882 described a fire at Thaddeus's first Boston home. The fire had started in his private study and destroyed most of his papers and books. Though Thaddeus himself escaped unharmed, the cause was never determined. Most intriguingly, I found a reference to Thaddeus in the Journal of William Chambers, a professor of comparative religion at Harvard, who died in 1895. The journal had been published posthumously in a small academic edition. One entry, dated October 1883, read, "Dinner this evening with T. Pierce," disturbed by his account of rituals observed during his travels among the islands. His description of the outer beings and their commerce with the islanders bears unsettling similarity to certain medieval European accounts of demonic pacts. When I suggested as much, Pierce became agitated, insisting that these entities were neither angels nor demons, but something else entirely, beings from spaces adjacent to our own, as he put it. He showed me a curious artifact, a black stone tablet with markings unlike any script I have encountered. Pierce claimed to have deciphered portions of it, though he would not share his translations. He spoke of doors left ajar and exchanges of value. I left earlier than planned, troubled by his intensity on these subjects. I copied the passage, my hand shaking slightly. Was this evidence of the bargain Margaret Sullivan had spoken of? Had my ancestor truly made some kind of supernatural pact for the family's wealth? It seemed absurd in the cold light of the library reading room, and yet I could not explain the photograph. The woman without a shadow who appeared in an image from 1912, over 60 years ago, looking exactly as she had appeared in my bedroom corner just hours before. I needed to know more about her. If she was real, whatever real might mean in this context, then perhaps there were other records of her appearances. I searched through the library's resources for accounts of similar phenomena: figures without shadows, uninvited guests at significant events, disappearances like Catherine Whiteley's. As the day wore on, I found scattered references that might be relevant: folklore about spectral wedding guests, historical accounts of mysterious figures appearing in group portraits, even scientific papers on optical anomalies in early photography. None provided definitive answers, but together they suggested I was not the first to encounter such phenomena. By the time the library closed, my eyes were burning with fatigue and my notes filled several pages. I drove home through a light rain, the streetlights casting blurred halos through the wet windshield. The old brownstone was dark and silent as I let myself in, dropping my keys on the hall table with a metallic clatter that echoed through the empty rooms. I fixed myself a simple dinner and a strong drink, then spread my notes and the photograph on the dining room table. Looking at it again under the warm light of the chandelier, I noticed something I had missed before. The woman without a shadow seemed to be looking directly at the camera, at me, while everyone else was focused slightly to the left of the photographer, perhaps at an assistant or a second camera set up for another shot. And there was something else. The diamond pendant my great-grandmother wore, mentioned in the newspaper account as a wedding gift from Jonathan. In the photograph, Eliza's hand was raised to it, as if unconsciously protective. It caught the light strangely, seeming almost to glow. I remembered Mrs. Winters at the Pierce Museum, mentioning items from the wedding in their collection, including my great-grandfather's cufflinks, but she hadn't mentioned the pendant. What had happened to it? I retrieved my great-grandmother's journal from where I'd left it on my bedside table and began paging through the entries following the wedding, looking for any mention of the pendant or further encounters with the mysterious woman. There, on July 10, 1912, nearly a month after the wedding. Jonathan has gone to New York on business, and I find myself restless in his absence. The house seems to watch me. Twice now I have entered rooms to find the curtains disturbed, as if someone had just stepped away from the window. Last night I woke to the sound of footsteps in the corridor, but when I looked, there was no one there, only a cold draft, and the pendant on my dressing table had been moved. I no longer wear it, though Jonathan does not understand why. I cannot explain to him what I feel when it touches my skin, a sensation of being observed, evaluated, measured for some purpose I cannot comprehend. And later, on August 3rd, Catherine Whiteley still has not been found. Her parents called today, asking if we had heard anything. Mrs. Whiteley was distraught, convinced that Catherine would never have left willingly. Mr. Whiteley mentioned that all her belongings remained untouched. Even the small valise she always kept packed for short trips. The police have all but abandoned the search. I offered what comfort I could, but found myself unable to meet Mrs. Whiteley's eyes, for in them I saw a knowledge, unspoken but certain, that whatever took Catherine is somehow connected to us, to the Pierces. I am afraid, not just for myself, but for the child I now suspect I carry. I have not told Jonathan yet. I cannot bear to see his joy when my own heart is so troubled. The child she carried would have been my grandfather, Richard Pierce. Born in March 1913, he would later marry and have only one child himself, my mother, who died when I was just 10 years old. The Pierce line, once so robust, had dwindled to a single branch. To me, I continued reading, finding scattered references to unease, to strange dreams, to the sensation of being watched. Then on October 31st, 1912, it came to me last night. She came, the woman from the wedding, standing at the foot of our bed. Jonathan slept on, unaware, but I was suddenly, completely awake. She looked exactly as she had that day in June, tall, severe, in that same dark dress that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. She did not speak, but I heard her nonetheless, inside my mind. "The firstborn daughter," she said. "Remember the bargain?" When I asked what bargain, she only smiled. It was not a kind expression. Thaddeus knew. The pendant is a token of our agreement, a reminder and a link. When the time comes, it will guide us to what is ours. I wanted to wake Jonathan, but found I could not move or speak. She approached the bed and reached out one long, pale finger, touching it to my forehead. The chill of that touch remains with me still. "Sleep now," she said. "Dream of what is to come." And I did sleep, eventually. But my dreams were of a girl I did not recognize, a child with Pierce eyes but a face I do not know. She stood at the edge of a precipice, and behind her, waiting in shadows, was the woman in the dark dress. When I woke, the pendant, which I had locked in my jewelry box, was around my neck once more. I closed the journal, a deep unease settling over me. My great-grandmother had believed, it seemed, that some supernatural entity had made a claim on a female descendant of the Pierce line. But the woman without a shadow had disappeared along with Catherine Whiteley, and no daughters had been born to the Pierce family for decades afterward, until my grandmother Eleanor. Had the debt somehow transferred to another generation? Was that why the woman had appeared in my bedroom? Because I was the last of the Pierce line? The grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, startling me from my thoughts. The house suddenly seemed too quiet, the shadows in the corners too deep. I gathered my notes and the photograph, intending to continue my research in the morning. As I stood, I caught a glimpse of movement reflected in the dining room window, a tall figure passing behind me. I whirled around, but the room was empty. Heart pounding, I hurried upstairs to my bedroom and locked the door behind me, feeling foolish even as I did so. What protection would a locked door provide against something that might not be entirely physical? I slept poorly that night, drifting in and out of unsettling dreams. In one, I stood in the garden of the Pierce estate, watching as the wedding party arranged themselves for the photograph. My great-grandmother turned to look at me, her eyes wide with recognition and fear. She tried to speak, to warn me of something, but no sound came from her moving lips. The woman without a shadow stood beside her, one hand resting possessively on Eliza's shoulder, her black eyes fixed on me with terrible intent. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the cool room. In the dimness, I could make out a figure standing in the corner, tall, slender, motionless. I fumbled for the lamp, my fingers clumsy with fear. When light flooded the room, the corner was empty. But on the bedside table, where no jewelry had been the night before, lay a diamond pendant on a delicate gold chain. I recoiled, nearly falling from the bed in my haste to get away from it. It was identical to the one my great-grandmother wore in the wedding photograph, an oval diamond surrounded by smaller stones, catching the light with unnatural brightness. How had it appeared in my room? Had it been in the house all along, perhaps tucked away in some forgotten drawer or box? Or had someone brought it here? With trembling hands, I picked it up, half expecting it to be cold to the touch. But it was neither cold nor warm, its weight in my palm the only evidence of its physical reality. I examined it carefully, looking for any markings or inscriptions that might give a clue to its origins. On the back of the setting, nearly too small to see, was an engraving, not initials or a date, as might be expected, but a symbol, a vertical line intersected by 3 horizontal lines of different lengths, forming something like an abstract tree or a distorted letter E. I didn't recognize it from any alphabet or symbolic system I knew of, but it triggered a memory. The journal entry about Thaddeus Pierce and the black stone tablet with unknown markings. Could this be one of those symbols? I needed to know more about the pendant. If it was indeed the same one given to my great-grandmother at her wedding, how had it found its way to me? And why now? I decided to return to the Pierce Museum. Perhaps Mrs. Winters would know something about it, or there might be records that mentioned its fate after my great-grandmother stopped wearing it. Before leaving, I hesitated, unsure what to do with the pendant itself. Some instinct warned me against wearing it, but I was equally reluctant to leave it behind. In the end, I placed it in a small velvet pouch and put it in my pocket, where I could feel its weight like a small, dense star pulling at the fabric. The drive to the museum seemed longer than before, the landscape blurring in a soft October rain. When I arrived, the parking lot was empty except for a single car, presumably Mrs. Winters. The closed sign was displayed in the window, but when I knocked, the curator appeared, looking unsurprised to see me. "Mr. Pierce?" she said, unlocking the door. "I thought you might return." I followed her inside, struck again by the stillness of the place, as if the house itself were listening. "Mrs. Winters, I have more questions about my great-grandmother's wedding, specifically about a piece of jewelry." I took out the velvet pouch and carefully emptied the pendant onto my palm. "Do you recognize this?" Mrs. Winters stared at it, her face draining of color. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "It appeared in my bedroom this morning. I believe it's the pendant Jonathan Pierce gave to my great-grandmother as a wedding gift." Mrs. Winters reached out a hesitant hand, then drew back without touching it. "May I see the back?" I turned it over, revealing the strange symbol. Mrs. Winters closed her eyes briefly, as if confirming something she had feared. "Mr. Pierce, that pendant hasn't been seen since your grandmother Eleanor died in 1952. It was supposed to be buried with her." I felt a chill run through me. "What do you mean, supposed to be?" Mrs. Winters sighed. "Come with me. There's something you should see." She led me through the museum to a small room I hadn't noticed on my previous visit, a cramped space off the main hall that might once have been a butler's pantry. Inside was a desk, filing cabinets, and walls lined with bookshelves. "This is my private research room," she explained, unlocking a cabinet and removing a thin file folder. "What I'm about to show you isn't part of the official museum collection. These are documents I've gathered over the years about certain aspects of the Pierce family history that aren't included in the public narrative." She opened the folder on the desk. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and a few photographs. She selected one document, a yellowed page that appeared to be torn from a journal. "This is from the diary of Dr. James Thornton, who was the Pierce family physician for over 40 years. This entry is from April 1952, shortly after your grandmother's death. The handwriting was cramped but legible. Attended the funeral of Eleanor Pierce today. A sad business. The family line now reduced to a single grandson, with Richard's wife already 5 years in her grave. The old matter of the pendant arose again. Jonathan insisted it be buried with Eleanor, despite tradition dictating it should pass to Richard's wife, or, in her absence, be held in trust for a future female descendant. I did not oppose him. Indeed, I have long harbored concerns about the object. The circumstances of its acquisition have never been satisfactorily explained to me, nor has the connection between it and the disturbing events of 1912 been fully illuminated. Perhaps it is best that it be interred, though I confess I felt a certain unease as the casket was lowered into the ground. Some things, I fear, cannot be so easily laid to rest. I looked up at Mrs. Winters, questions forming faster than I could ask them. What did he mean by the disturbing events of 1912? And what did he know about how the pendant was acquired? Mrs. Winters spread her hands. That's what I've been trying to piece together for years. Dr. Thornton didn't elaborate in his journal, at least not in the portions I've been able to access. But I've found other fragments. She showed me more documents, a letter from Jonathan Pierce to his lawyer in 1930, instructing that the pendant never be sold or removed from Pierce ownership. A note from my grandfather Richard to Dr. Thornton, expressing concern about his mother Eleanor's increasing obsession with the pendant and its supposed powers. A statement from a housemaid employed by the Pierces in 1912, describing how she had found my great-grandmother Eliza sleepwalking one night, the pendant clutched in her hand, whispering to it in a language the maid did not recognize. And then there's this, Mrs. Winters said, pulling out a small worn notebook. I found it hidden in a secret compartment in Thaddeus Pierce's desk when the museum acquired it. It appears to be a kind of cipher or translation key. The notebook contained lists of symbols, including the one on the back of the pendant, paired with words in English and another language I didn't recognize. The writing was faded and difficult to decipher, but I could make out a few phrases. Doorway, exchange, blood price, firstborn. Do you know what language this is? I asked. Mrs. Winters shook her head. I've consulted several linguists. It doesn't match any known language, ancient or modern. One suggested it might be a constructed language, something Thaddeus created himself, perhaps as a code, or something taught to him, I murmured, remembering William Chambers' journal entry about Thaddeus and the Blackstone tablet. Mrs. Winters gave me a sharp look. You've found something in your own research. I told her about Chambers' journal and the references to Thaddeus's travels, the rituals he had observed, and the outer beings he had spoken of. As I spoke, Mrs. Winters's expression grew increasingly troubled. When I finished, she went to a bookshelf and removed a heavy volume bound in faded green cloth. This is a history of Arkham and the surrounding region, published in 1897, she said, placing it on the desk and opening it to a marked page. There's a section here about local folklore and superstitions. One passage in particular has always interested me. The page showed an illustration of a tall, thin figure standing beside what appeared to be a doorway or portal, with smaller human figures kneeling before it. The caption read, "The Doorkeeper, as depicted in a colonial-era woodcut." Local legend held that this entity could grant wishes in exchange for future considerations. Mrs. Winters pointed to the accompanying text. Among the more persistent legends of the region is that of the Doorkeeper, a being neither human nor divine, said to appear at moments of transition, births, marriages, deaths, to those who have entered into compacts with its kind. Such compacts, according to folklore, typically involve an exchange of favors, immediate benefit for the supplicant, with payment to be collected at a later date. The nature of this payment varied in different accounts, but commonly involved the surrender of a family member, typically a child or young woman. These beliefs, clearly derived from European fairy traditions transplanted to New England soil, had largely died out by the mid-19th century, though isolated reports of tall, shadowy figures at significant family events persisted into more recent times. I stared at the illustration, recognizing the tall, slender silhouette that had appeared in my bedroom. "The woman without a shadow," I said softly. "The doorkeeper. That would be my guess." Mrs. Winters agreed. "And if the local legends have any truth to them, her appearance at your great-grandparents' wedding, and now in your home, suggests that an old debt is coming due. But why now? Why me?" Mrs. Winters hesitated, then asked, "Mr. Pierce, is there something you haven't told me? Some recent change in your life, perhaps?" I thought about it. My grandmother died a few months ago. I've been sorting through her belongings, finding old family records. The photograph. "Anything else?" she pressed. "Any personal developments?" And then I understood what she was asking. "No, I'm not married. I was briefly, but we divorced 2 years ago. There are no children." "No possibility of children?" I shook my head, feeling oddly defensive. My ex-wife and I had difficulties in that area. It was one of the reasons for our divorce. The doctors said I'm unlikely to ever father children. Mrs. Winters nodded slowly. "Then perhaps that's why the doorkeeper has turned her attention to you. If the debt involves a firstborn daughter of the Pierce line, and you are the last Pierce, unable to produce children, then the debt can never be paid," I finished. "But what does that mean? What happens when such a bargain can't be fulfilled?" "I don't know," Mrs. Winters admitted. "The folklore doesn't address that possibility, but I doubt the doorkeeper, or whatever she represents, We'll simply write off the debt." She closed the book and looked at me with genuine concern. "Mr. Pierce, I think you should be very careful. The pendant's appearance in your home after being buried for over 20 years suggests that forces are in motion that we don't fully understand. If I were you, I would consider returning it to your grandmother's grave. And if that doesn't work, if the doorkeeper keeps appearing?" Mrs. Winters didn't have an answer for that. After a moment, she suggested, "Perhaps Margaret Sullivan might know more. The Sullivan women have always had a connection to these matters." I thanked Mrs. Winters for her help and left the museum, the pendant heavy in my pocket. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, the air heavy with the promise of more to come. I decided to take her advice and visit Margaret Sullivan again before returning to Boston. Margaret's cottage looked different in the gray afternoon light, smaller, somehow, and more isolated among its wild roses and herbs. When she opened the door, her bright eyes took in my expression at once. "You've learned more," she said. "Not a question. Come in then. I've just made scones." In her cluttered kitchen, over tea and warm scones with clotted cream, I told her everything. The pendant's appearance in my bedroom, Mrs. Winters' research, the connection to the folklore figure known as the doorkeeper, and the apparent impossibility of fulfilling the bargain made by Thaddeus Pierce. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if confirming something she had already suspected. When I finished, she sat in silence for several moments, her gnarled hands wrapped around her teacup. "Show me the pendant," she said finally. I placed it on the table between us. Margaret didn't touch it, but leaned forward to examine the symbol on its back. "A doorway," she said. "That's what that mark represents. A way between worlds." She sat back, her expression grave. "The doorkeeper isn't just a collector of debts, Mr. Pierce. She's a guardian of passages. The folklore Mrs. Winters showed you is accurate as far as it goes, but incomplete. The being you call the doorkeeper doesn't just want payment. She wants to open a way. A way for what? For those who wait on the other side. The outer beings, as your ancestor called them. They can't enter our world freely. They need anchors, connections. The pendant is such a connection, and so is the bloodline of the family that made the bargain." I felt a chill at her words. "Are you saying that Thaddeus Pierce somehow invited these beings into our world?" "Not fully," Margaret said, "but he opened a door a crack. The prosperity he gained, the sudden business insights, the fortunate investments, those came from knowledge provided by the outer beings. In exchange, they wanted a foothold, a human vessel of Pierce blood, particularly a female who could serve as a more permanent anchor. Catherine Whiteley," I said, remembering. "She was engaged to my great-grandmother's brother. She would have become a Pierce by marriage." "Yes, but that wasn't enough," Margaret explained. "They wanted a true bloodline descendant. When Catherine disappeared, taken, I believe, as a temporary measure, the bargain remained unfulfilled. The doorkeeper has been waiting for a female Pierce ever since, but there aren't any," I pointed out. "My grandmother Eleanor was the last, and she died without having a daughter. I'm the end of the line, and I can't have children." Margaret gave me a long, considering look. "Perhaps that's why the doorkeeper has appeared to you now. If the bargain can't be fulfilled in the way originally intended, she may be seeking alternatives." "What kind of alternatives?" She shrugged. "I don't know, but I think you should be prepared for her to make her intentions clear soon." She nodded at the pendant. "That's her way of announcing herself. Her calling card, you might say. Should I return it to my grandmother's grave, as Mrs. Winters suggested?" Margaret shook her head. "It would only find its way back to you. No, I think you need to confront this directly." She rose from the table and went to a cabinet, returning with a small cloth bag. "Salt," she explained, opening it to show me the white crystals inside. "An old protection. Make a circle of it around your bed tonight. It may not stop her, but it will force her to declare her purpose before entering the circle." And I must have looked skeptical, because Margaret smiled faintly. "Humor an old woman, Mr. Pierce. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways when dealing with old entities." I thanked her and took the bag of salt, feeling slightly foolish but unwilling to dismiss her advice entirely. As I was leaving, she caught my arm, much as Mrs. Winters had done. "One more thing," she said quietly. "The pendant. Don't wear it, whatever you do. It's a tether, a way for her to find you, and a way for her to pull you across, if that's what she intends." With that unsettling warning, I drove back to Boston through the gathering dusk, the pendant in one pocket, the bag of salt in another, and a growing sense of dread in my heart. That night, feeling more than a little absurd, I poured a circle of salt around my bed as Margaret had instructed. I placed the pendant on my dresser, far enough from the bed that I would have to get up to reach it. Then, exhausted from the day's revelations and the previous night's disturbed sleep, I fell into a deep slumber almost as soon as my head touched the pillow. The dream came quickly this time. I stood in a vast, dim space that seemed neither indoors nor outdoors. The ground beneath my feet was solid, but had no definable texture. In the distance I could make out what appeared to be doorways, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, standing freely without walls to support them, each emitting a faint light of a slightly different hue. Before me stood the woman from the photograph, the doorkeeper. Up close she was both more and less than human. Her proportions slightly wrong, her skin too smooth, her eyes too dark and deep. She wore the same dark dress which moved subtly even when she was still, as if responding to currents I couldn't feel. "Thomas Pierce," she said, her voice neither male nor female, but somewhere in between, resonant with harmonics that made my teeth ache. Last of the line, bearer of the mark. I found I could speak, though my voice sounded thin and weak in this place. "What mark?" She smiled, revealing teeth that were too numerous and too sharp. "The mark of the bargain. The debt that must be paid." She gestured to the pendant, which now hung in the air between us, rotating slowly. Thaddeus Pierce sought power and wealth beyond his means. We provided. The cost was agreed upon, a daughter of the bloodline, to serve as anchor and gateway. The debt remains unpaid. "There are no daughters in the Pierce line," I said. "I am the last, and I will have no children. The bargain cannot be fulfilled." The doorkeeper's smile widened, becoming something terrible. "There are always alternatives, Thomas Pierce. The bloodline may end, but the debt does not. You yourself can serve as the anchor." Fear coursed through me. "What does that mean?" "It means you will come with me," she said simply, "beyond the threshold, to the spaces between spaces where my kind dwell. You will be the doorway through which they enter your world, as was agreed." "I never agreed to anything." "Your blood agreed. Your ancestors' choice binds you. The pendant has found you, as it was always meant to do." She extended a long-fingered hand. "Come now. It is time." I tried to back away, but found I couldn't move. The pendant began to drift toward me, its diamond catching non-existent light and fracturing it into painful prismatic shards. "No," I said, struggling against the invisible force holding me. "I reject this bargain. I am not bound by Thaddeus's actions." The doorkeeper's expression changed, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her inhuman features. "The bargain cannot be broken. The door must open." "Then find another door," I said, desperation giving me courage. "The Pierces are done with you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then I felt something beneath my feet, the circle of salt glowing faintly in this dreamscape. The doorkeeper saw it too, her dark eyes narrowing. "Old protections," she hissed. "They will not save you for long." But even as she spoke, I felt myself being pulled back, away from her, away from the pendant and the countless doorways. Her form began to blur, the dream dissolving around me. The last thing I heard before waking was her voice, fainter now, but still threaded with that painful resonance. "I will return when the moon is dark, 3 nights from now. Be ready, Thomas Pierce. One way or another, the door will open." I woke with a gasp, my body drenched in cold sweat despite the warmth of my bedroom. The circle of salt around my bed was undisturbed, but on my dresser, the pendant glowed with an inner light that slowly faded as I watched, like an ember dying. 3 nights until the new moon. 3 nights to find a way to break a bargain made a century ago by an ancestor I had never met. I didn't go back to sleep that night. Instead, I gathered all the materials I had collected, my notes, the photograph, my great-grandmother's journal, the information from Mrs. Winters and Margaret Sullivan, and spread them on my dining room table, searching for anything that might help me. What did I know for certain? Thaddeus Pierce had apparently made some kind of supernatural pact around 1880, receiving wealth and business success in exchange for a future female descendant who would serve as an anchor for entities he had encountered during his travels. The pendant was a symbol and instrument of this pact. The woman without a shadow, the doorkeeper, was some kind of intermediary or collector, tasked with ensuring the debt was paid. Now, with no female Pierces left and the bloodline about to end with me, the doorkeeper intended to take me instead, using me as the doorway these entities needed. But how could I break a bargain I hadn't made? And what would happen if I somehow succeeded? Would the wealth and success the Pierces had enjoyed for generations be retroactively revoked? Did I even have the right to make that choice? As dawn broke, I was no closer to answers. Exhausted but too wired to rest, I decided to return once more to the Pierce estate. Perhaps there was something else in the archives, something Mrs. Winters had overlooked or hadn't shared with me. I arrived just as the museum was opening. Mrs. Winters looked surprised to see me again so soon, and even more surprised by my haggard appearance. "Mr. Pierce, are you all right? You look like you haven't slept." I gave her a brief account of my dream and the doorkeeper's ultimatum. To her credit, she didn't question my sanity or suggest I seek medical help. Instead, she listened with growing concern. "3 nights," she repeated when I had finished. "That's not much time. Come with me. I want to check something." She led me back to her private research room and pulled out a lunar calendar. "Yes, the new moon is on November 2nd, 3 nights from now. And that's significant for another reason." She reached for another book on her shelf, a history of local customs and traditions. November 2nd is the final day of All-Hallowtide, what some cultures call the Day of the Dead. In folklore, it's considered one of the times when the veil between worlds is thinnest. "A threshold moment," I murmured, remembering Margaret Sullivan's words about the doorkeeper appearing at threshold moments, like births, weddings, and deaths. "Exactly," Mrs. Winters said. "If this entity is going to attempt to take you through some kind of portal or doorway, the new moon on November 2nd would be the ideal time." "How do I stop it?" I asked bluntly. "How do I break this bargain?" Mrs. Winters looked troubled. "I don't know. The folklore doesn't offer much guidance for breaking such pacts. In most stories, the debt must be paid one way or another. There has to be a way," I insisted. "I can't just wait for this thing to come for me." Mrs. Winters thought for a moment, then said, "There is someone else you might speak with. Reverend Morris at St. Michael's Church, the same church where your great-grandparents were married. He's something of a scholar on local supernatural lore. His predecessor was the Reverend Morris mentioned in Margaret Sullivan's grandmother's journal, the one she consulted about the photograph. Yes, the current Reverend Morris has continued his grandfather's research. He might know something about breaking supernatural pacts." It was a thin hope, but better than nothing. I thanked Mrs. Winters and drove to St. Michael's, a small stone church on the outskirts of town. The building was even older than the Pierce estate, dating back to the early 19th century, its weathered gray stones and slim spire giving it a somber, austere appearance. Inside, the church was cool and dim, scented with beeswax candles and old wood. A silver-haired man in clerical attire was arranging flowers on the altar. He looked up as I approached, his expression curious but welcoming. "Good morning," he said. "May I help you?" I introduced myself and explained that Mrs. Winters had suggested I speak with him about his research. I was hesitant to reveal the full story immediately, unsure how a man of the cloth might react to tales of supernatural pacts and otherworldly entities. But Reverend Morris surprised me. "Ah, you must be the Pierce descendant Helen mentioned might be coming." She called ahead. He gestured toward a pew. "Sit down, Mr. Pierce. I understand you've had some unusual experiences related to your family history." Relieved that I wouldn't have to convince him I wasn't delusional, I gave him an abbreviated version of recent events: the photograph, the pendant, the doorkeeper, and the approaching deadline of the new moon. Reverend Morris listened intently, occasionally nodding as if confirming information he already possessed. When I finished, he said, "Your situation is not without precedent, Mr. Pierce. Throughout history, there have been accounts of families entering into pacts with entities that exist outside our normal understanding of reality. Some traditions call them demons, others fae or jinn or various other names. The doorkeeper appears to be one such entity, a threshold guardian between our world and somewhere else. Can such pacts be broken?" I asked, "without fulfilling the original terms?" The Reverend considered this. "It depends on the nature of the agreement. In most theological and folkloric traditions, there are 3 ways to break such a pact: fulfillment, substitution, or invalidation. Fulfillment is impossible," I said. "There are no female Pierces left, and I can't have children. Substitution would mean finding someone else to take your place," he continued. "But I wouldn't recommend that path, morally speaking." "No, of course not," I agreed quickly. "What about invalidation? What does that involve?" "Proving that the original agreement has been violated in some way, or finding a loophole in its terms." He paused, thinking. "You said the pendant is a symbol of the pact?" I nodded, taking it from my pocket but not removing it from its velvet pouch. "It has a symbol on the back, some kind of doorway marking. May I see it?" Hesitantly, I handed him the pouch. Reverend Morris carefully emptied the pendant into his palm, studying it without touching it directly. After a moment, he returned it to the pouch and handed it back to me. The symbol is indeed a doorway, but a specific type, what some traditions would call a one-way door. It allows passage in only one direction. He looked at me seriously. Mr. Pierce, I believe I understand the nature of your ancestors' bargain more clearly now. The doorkeeper didn't just promise wealth and success to Thaddeus Pierce. She offered him knowledge from beyond, information that would guarantee his business success. Yes, that fits with what I've learned, I confirmed. But such knowledge comes at a price. The entities that provided it want access to our world, but they can't enter freely. They need a human anchor, as you put it. Not just any human, one with a specific bloodline marked by the bargain. Me, I said quietly. You, or a female descendant, had that been possible. The female aspect is significant in many mystical traditions. Women are often seen as more receptive to otherworldly influences, more capable of serving as vessels or conduits. But why does the doorkeeper want to take me beyond the threshold? Wouldn't that defeat the purpose of having an anchor in this world? Reverend Morris frowned. Unless the anchor doesn't need to be physically present in our world. Perhaps your essence, your bloodline, can serve as the anchor even if you yourself are elsewhere. A horrible thought occurred to me. Or perhaps she intends to bring me back, changed in some way. A vessel for something else? The Reverend nodded grimly. A possibility we cannot discount. How do I stop this? I asked again. How do I invalidate the bargain? Reverend Morris stood and walked to a small door behind the altar. Come with me. There's something you should see. He led me to a narrow staircase that descended beneath the church. At the bottom was a small stone-walled room lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets. A desk occupied the center, illuminated by a single hanging light bulb. My grandfather's archive, he explained. He collected accounts of supernatural phenomena in this region for over 50 years, including, I believe, some information about the Pierce family. He unlocked a cabinet and withdrew a thick folder, yellowed with age. My grandfather kept extensive notes on what he called threshold entities, beings that existed at the boundaries between worlds. The doorkeeper was one he documented in particular detail. The folder contained handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and crude sketches of tall, thin figures standing beside doorways or windows. One page caught my attention, a detailed drawing of a pendant identical to the one in my pocket, alongside notes in cramped handwriting. The Pierce artifact, examined 1913. Jonathan P., reluctant but concerned for wife's mental state. Diamond of unusual clarity, setting unremarkable except for symbol on reverse. Identical to markings found in T. Pierce's journal. See file T17. Properties: cold to touch, occasional luminescence noted, causes discomfort to sensitives. Connection to Catherine W. disappearance unproven but suspected. I looked up at Reverend Morris. Your grandfather examined the pendant? He nodded. Jonathan Pierce consulted him about his wife's deteriorating mental state. She had become obsessed with the pendant, claiming it spoke to her. My grandfather recognized it as an object of power, what some might call a talisman or focus. Did he know how to neutralize it? He attempted to, Reverend Morris said. According to his notes, he performed a blessing ritual and advised Jonathan to bury the pendant on consecrated ground. But it seems that Jonathan didn't follow that advice. Or if he did, it wasn't effective. I remembered Mrs. Winter's information about the pendant being buried with my grandmother Eleanor in 1952, only to reappear in my bedroom decades later. Consecrated ground didn't hold it, perhaps because the bargain remained unfulfilled, the Reverend suggested. The pendant is a physical manifestation of the pact. As long as the agreement stands, the pendant will find its way to a Pierce. He turned more pages in the folder, stopping at a section labeled Breaking Bonds with Threshold Entities. The notes here were more fragmented, references to various religious and mystical traditions, rituals from different cultures, all aimed at severing connections with otherworldly beings. My grandfather believed that such pacts could be broken by a formal renunciation, performed at a place of power, preferably at the same type of threshold moment when the original bargain was struck. He looked up at me. Do you know where and when Thaddeus Pierce made his agreement with the doorkeeper? I shook my head. Not exactly. Sometime around 1880, after he returned from his travels, possibly at the original Pierce home in Boston, though that building was destroyed in a fire in 1882. The fire might be significant, Reverend Morris mused. Often such entities use fire as a way to erase evidence of their interactions. He continued reading through the notes, finally stopping at a passage near the end. Threshold entities require invitation to cross over completely. The initial bargain opens a crack, but full manifestation needs explicit acceptance by the marked one. Refusal may not break the bond entirely, but can prevent the worst consequences. So if I simply refuse to go with the doorkeeper when she comes for me, it might buy you time, the Reverend conceded, but it wouldn't solve the underlying problem. The bargain would remain in effect, and she would likely continue to pursue you. He closed the folder thoughtfully. Mr. Pierce, I believe your best chance lies in a formal renunciation of the pact, performed at a place of significance to both your family and the doorkeeper. And it must be done at the threshold moment, the new moon on November 2nd. What place would that be? The Pierce estate? Perhaps. Or, he hesitated, there might be another location, one with deeper significance. My grandfather's notes mention that Thaddeus Pierce built a private study in the woods behind the estate, a place where he could work undisturbed. According to local rumors, it was there that he conducted his more unorthodox research. I've never heard of such a building, I said, surprised. It wouldn't be on any official records or maps. Such places rarely are. But if it exists, and if it was the site of the original pact, it would be the ideal location for a renunciation. I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since the pendant had appeared in my bedroom. How would I find it? That, said Reverend Morris, is where we might need Margaret Sullivan's assistance. If anyone can locate a hidden threshold place, it would be a Sullivan woman. We thanked Reverend Morris for his help and drove directly to Margaret Sullivan's cottage. The day was advancing, the October sun already beginning its early descent, casting long shadows across the road. Margaret was in her garden when we arrived, cutting the last of her herbs before the first frost. She looked unsurprised to see us. You've been busy, Thomas Pierce, she said, noting my companion with a nod. Good afternoon, Reverend. Miss Sullivan, he replied with a slight bow. We're hoping you might assist us with a matter of some urgency. Inside, over yet another pot of mint tea, we explained our theory about Thaddeus Pierce's hidden study and the possibility of performing a renunciation ritual at the new moon. Margaret listened, her bright eyes moving between us. When we finished, she nodded slowly. Yes, there was such a place. The old women of the town called it the thinking house. No one went near it, not even children on dares. Animals avoided it too. It had a wrongness about it. Do you know where it is? I asked eagerly. Was, she corrected. It burned long ago, but the foundation remains, and that would be enough. The threshold isn't in the building itself, but in the place. Can you take us there? Reverend Morris asked. Margaret studied us for a long moment, then sighed. I can, but not today. The approach is difficult in the dark, and we're losing daylight. Tomorrow morning, I'll show you the way. That will give you time to prepare for the night after. The new moon. What kind of preparation do we need? I asked. Salt, for one thing, she said practically. More than the small bag I gave you. Iron, too. Threshold entities dislike cold iron, and something of significance to you personally. An object that represents who you are, separate from the Pierce bloodline. I thought about it. My doctoral medallion, perhaps. I earned that on my own merit. That would serve, she agreed. And you'll need to learn the words of renunciation. She looked at Reverend Morris. I assume your grandfather's notes included such a formula? He nodded. Several variants. I can adapt one specifically for this case. Good. Margaret stood, signaling that the conversation was over. Meet me here at dawn tomorrow. Wear sturdy shoes and bring water. The path is not an easy one. That night, back in my Boston home, I again drew a circle of salt around my bed, placing the pendant far across the room. I slept fitfully, but was not visited by the doorkeeper, though several times I woke with the certainty that something was watching me from the shadows. In the morning, I gathered what I would need. A large bag of salt, an iron fireplace poker, the closest thing to cold iron I could find in the house, my doctoral medallion, and a copy of the renunciation ritual that Reverend Morris had prepared and delivered to me late the previous night. The words were a curious mixture of Latin, English, and symbols that matched those in Thaddeus's notebook, a mirror of whatever ritual he had used to establish the pact in the first place. I arrived at Margaret's cottage just as the sun was breaking over the horizon. She was ready, dressed in sturdy boots and carrying a walking stick. Reverend Morris pulled up a few minutes later. It's about 3 miles through the woods, Margaret told us as we set off. The path hasn't been maintained in decades, so stay close. She led us behind her cottage and into the forest that backed onto her property. At first, there was no discernible trail, but Margaret moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Gradually, I began to notice subtle markers. A bent branch here, a peculiar arrangement of stones there, that seemed to guide her way. The forest grew denser as we walked, the morning light filtering green and gold through the canopy of oak and maple trees. It was beautiful in the way that wild places are beautiful, unconcerned with human presence, following rhythms far older than our brief lives. After about an hour of steady hiking, I began to feel a change in the atmosphere. The bird songs that had accompanied our journey grew less frequent, then ceased entirely. The air felt heavier, somehow, as if we were walking through water rather than air. Even the light seemed different, flatter, less vibrant. "We're approaching the threshold area," Margaret said quietly. "You feel it, don't you?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Beside me, Reverend Morris made a small sign of the cross. "It's strongest at the new moon," Margaret continued, "but it's always present to some degree. A thinness in the world." A few minutes later, we emerged into a small clearing. At its center were the remains of a stone foundation, a rectangular outline about 20 feet by 15, with crumbling walls that rose no more than 2 feet above the forest floor. Blackened stones and a few twisted metal objects suggested a fierce fire. But what caught my attention was the doorway. It still stood, incongruously intact among the ruins, a stone arch without a door, leading nowhere. On its keystone was carved the same symbol that appeared on the back of the pendant. "The Thinking House," Margaret said simply, "or what remains of it." Reverend Morris approached the doorway cautiously, not stepping through it but examining the stonework. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he murmured. "These aren't local stones. They must have been brought from somewhere else." "From the islands," Margaret said. "That's what my grandmother told me. Thaddeus Pierce brought them back from his travels. Black stones that shine blue in certain lights." I circled the foundation, trying to imagine what the building had looked like when intact. It would have been small but solid, a single room perhaps, with the doorway as its only entrance, a place of isolation and focus, a place to commune with entities from beyond. "This is where he made the pact," I said, certain of it, "and this is where I need to break it." Margaret nodded. "At midnight tomorrow, when the moon is dark, you'll need to stand within the foundation, before the doorway, and speak the words of renunciation." "Will it work?" I asked Reverend Morris. He looked troubled. "It should. The conditions are right. The threshold place, the threshold time, the blood descendant. But such entities are tricky. The doorkeeper may resist or try to twist the ritual to her advantage. That's why we'll be with you," Margaret said firmly. "Outside the foundation, keeping watch. The Reverend with his prayers, me with other protections." We spent another hour at the site, Reverend Morris walking me through the ritual and Margaret adding her own suggestions about how to focus my intent and strengthen my resolve. Then we made our way back through the forest, which seemed less oppressive on the return journey, as if relieved by our departure. Back at Margaret's cottage, we finalized our plans for the following night. We would meet at sunset and make our way to the Thinking House by lamplight, giving us plenty of time to prepare the site before midnight. As I was leaving, Margaret pressed something into my hand, a small cloth bag containing some dried herbs and what looked like a bird's claw. "For protection," she said simply. "Keep it with you until tomorrow night." I thanked her and drove back to Boston, my mind racing with all I had learned. Part of me still couldn't believe that I was planning to perform what amounted to a magical ritual to break a supernatural pact made by my ancestor. The rational, academic part of me insisted that this was all elaborate folklore and psychology, mass delusion, or perhaps a family history of mental illness manifesting in shared hallucinations. But the pendant was real. The photograph was real. The woman without a shadow was real. And tomorrow night, I would confront her in a place where worlds touched, and try to free the Pierce bloodline from a bargain made in ignorance or greed a century before. I spent that day in a strange limbo, alternating between intense preparation, memorizing the ritual, gathering additional supplies, and moments of complete disbelief at what I was doing. I called the university and arranged for a week's leave, citing a family emergency. In a way, it was the truth. That night, I drew my salt circle with extra care, placing Margaret's protective charm beneath my pillow. Whether due to the charm or simple exhaustion, I slept deeply and dreamlessly, waking at noon feeling more rested than I had in days. As the afternoon waned, I packed my supplies and drove back to Arkham. The sky was clear, the sunset painting the western horizon in shades of orange and deep purple as I pulled up to Margaret's cottage. She and Reverend Morris were waiting, each carrying a small pack. "Ready?" Margaret asked simply. I nodded, unable to find words adequate to the moment. We set off into the darkening forest, Margaret leading the way with a kerosene lantern that cast dancing shadows among the trees. The path seemed more difficult in the fading light, roots and stones appearing suddenly in our path, branches reaching like grasping hands. The silence was profound. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just the sound of our breathing and footsteps, muffled by the carpet of fallen leaves. When we reached the clearing, the last light had faded from the sky, leaving us in the deep blue twilight before true night. The stone doorway was a black silhouette against the darkening forest, its emptiness somehow more present, more significant than the solid stone that framed it. We set to work preparing the site. Reverend Morris established a perimeter of salt around the entire foundation, while Margaret placed small bundles of herbs and other objects I couldn't identify at key points around the clearing. I reviewed the ritual one last time, speaking the words under my breath, feeling their strange cadence on my tongue. As midnight approached, a mist began to rise from the forest floor, curling around our ankles and spiraling upward in slow, hypnotic patterns. The temperature dropped sharply, our breath becoming visible in pale clouds. "It's time," Margaret said, checking her watch by the light of the lantern. "Take your position, Thomas." I stepped over the low stone wall and into the foundation of the thinking house, moving to stand before the empty doorway. The pendant hung heavy in my pocket, and I could feel it growing warmer, as if awakening to the approaching moment. Reverend Morris handed me a small iron rod through the perimeter of salt. "Hold this in your left hand while you speak the words," he instructed. "Keep the pendant in your right. When the ritual is complete, you must cast the pendant through the doorway." I nodded, drawing the pendant from my pocket. In the darkness, it seemed to glow with a faint inner light, the diamond capturing and amplifying the distant stars. "We'll be right here," Margaret assured me. "Whatever happens, whatever you see or hear, complete the ritual. It's your only chance." The Reverend checked his watch. 2 minutes to midnight. "Begin when you're ready." I took a deep breath, centering myself as best I could. Then I began to speak the words of renunciation, my voice sounding strange and distant in the misty clearing. "Hear me, guardian of the threshold. I, Thomas Pierce, last of the bloodline of Thaddeus Pierce, stand at the doorway between worlds. I hold the token of the bargain, the symbol of the pact." As I spoke, the mist around me began to move more purposefully, gathering and thickening until it formed a vague human shape on the other side of the doorway. I acknowledge the debt incurred by my ancestor, but I declare it null and void. The terms cannot be met. The bloodline ends with me. No daughter will be born of Pierce blood. The mist figure solidified, becoming the familiar tall, slender silhouette of the doorkeeper. She stood just beyond the stone arch, watching me with eyes that were darker than the night around us. "The bargain cannot be broken," she said, her voice the same eerie, resonant tone I had heard in my dream. "A debt is owed. Payment must be made." "The debt is invalid," I countered, continuing the ritual. Thaddeus Pierce did not understand the true nature of the exchange. He was deceived about the cost. The doorkeeper tilted her head, a too fluid motion that sent a chill down my spine. He knew enough. He sought power beyond his means. We provided. The cost was clear, a daughter of the bloodline, to serve as anchor and gateway. "But no daughter has come," I said. "The Pierce line ends with me, barren and final. By your own terms, the bargain cannot be fulfilled." "Then you will serve in her place," the doorkeeper said, extending a hand through the doorway toward me. "The bloodline lives in you. It is sufficient." I felt a pull, as if invisible strings were attached to my core, drawing me toward the doorway. The pendant in my hand grew hot, almost too hot to hold, its diamond now glowing with a blue-white light that illuminated the clearing. "I reject the substitution," I said firmly, the next words of the ritual. "I am not what was promised. I am not what was agreed upon." The doorkeeper's form flickered like a candle in a draft. "The bargain must be honored. The door must open." "Then open it for another," I said, reaching the crucial part of the ritual. "I break the bond of blood. I sever the line of descent. I relinquish the wealth gained, the knowledge granted, the power bestowed. All benefits of the pact I hereby return." As I spoke, I felt something tearing within me. Not physical pain, but a wrenching sensation, as if something woven into my very being was being ripped away. I staggered but kept my feet, determined to finish. By iron and salt, by blood and bone, by my true name and purpose, I declare this bargain void. I held up my doctoral medallion in the hand that also gripped the iron rod. I am Thomas Pierce by birth, but I am myself by choice and action. The Pierces end with me, but I continue as my own man. The doorkeeper's form was fluctuating wildly now, stretching and compressing, her features blurring. You cannot. The door is open. The way is prepared. Not through me, I said, and flung the pendant through the stone archway. For an instant, nothing happened. Then the pendant seemed to stop in midair, suspended at the exact center of the doorway. The diamond flared with blinding intensity, forcing me to shield my eyes. Through my fingers, I saw the doorkeeper reaching for it, her form elongating impossibly as she stretched toward the glowing object. There was a sound like glass shattering, though nothing visible broke. The pendant exploded into fragments of light that hung in the air like frozen fireworks, then collapsed inward, taking the doorkeeper's form with them. A vacuum seemed to form at the center of the doorway, pulling at the air, at the mist, at the very substance of the night, and then it was over. The doorway stood empty, the pendant gone. The clearing returned to ordinary darkness. I stood shakily, aware of Margaret and Reverend Morris rushing toward me, breaking their vigil now that the ritual was complete. Did it work? I asked, my voice hoarse as if I had been screaming, though I had spoken only the ritual words. Look, Margaret said simply, pointing at the ground. At my feet, clearly visible in the renewed light of her lantern, was my shadow, complete and ordinary, exactly as it should be. It worked, Reverend Morris confirmed. The pact is broken. The door is closed. I felt a curious mixture of relief and loss. The relief was expected. I had escaped a fate I could barely comprehend. But the loss was surprising. It wasn't the pendant I mourned, nor even the supernatural connection I had briefly glimpsed. It was something deeper, more fundamental. The knowledge that with me, truly, the Pierce line would end. No children would carry the name forward. No descendants would remember the family stories. I was the final chapter in a book that had been writing itself for centuries. What happens now? I asked, more to myself than to my companions. Now you live, Margaret said simply, free of the past, free to make your own choices. Will there be consequences? I looked at Reverend Morris. For breaking the bargain? He considered this. Possibly. The wealth that came from the pact, it may diminish or disappear entirely. The Pierce fortune might dwindle, investments fail, properties lose value, but it will be natural losses, not supernatural punishment. I can live with that, I said, surprised to find it was true. The family money had never been terribly important to me. My academic career provided what I needed. At least I won't have to worry about ghostly wedding guests with missing shadows anymore. Margaret laughed, a bright, unexpected sound in the somber clearing. No, I don't think you will. Though you might want to check any group photographs carefully for a while, just to be sure. We made our way back through the forest, the journey seeming shorter and easier than before. The woods felt alive again, normal nighttime sounds returning, the air moving naturally among the trees. By the time we reached Margaret's cottage, I felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight I hadn't recognized had been lifted from my shoulders. Whether it was simply relief or some actual supernatural burden being removed, I couldn't say. Perhaps it didn't matter. I thanked Margaret and Reverend Morris for their help, promising to let them know if anything unusual occurred in the coming days. Then I drove back to Boston through the quiet night, the stars clear and bright above the road. In the months that followed, life returned to something resembling normalcy. I resumed my teaching duties, published a well-received paper on colonial trade patterns, even began dating again. A fellow professor from the English department, with a quick mind and a generous laugh. The Pierce Estate Museum closed that winter due to financial difficulties, the first of several economic reverses that would indeed diminish the family fortune, just as Reverend Morris had predicted. I didn't mind. I kept the brownstone on Beacon Hill, but sold most of the other properties and investments, using part of the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund at the university. The photograph of the 1912 wedding remained in my possession, though I had it professionally framed and hung it in my study, a reminder of mysteries encountered and resolved. All 40 guests were clearly visible, and all 40 cast proper shadows on the sunlit lawn. Sometimes, in the moments between waking and sleep, I thought I caught a glimpse of a tall, slender silhouette in the corner of my bedroom, but it never solidified, never approached, just a trick of shadow and memory, gradually fading as the years passed. The Pierce line ended with me as I had declared in the ritual, but Thomas Pierce, the man, continued on, writing his own story, free from ancestral bargains and supernatural debts. If there were other doors, other thresholds to cross, they would be of my own choosing, my own discovery. And sometimes that's the most important thing of all, to choose your own doors, your own shadows, your own path forward into the unknown future.